Hi everyone, it's Nathaniel again. Today I'm going to do something a little bit different. I do have a couple of books that I want to briefly talk about, but because of something that happened connected to these two, I wanted to talk about some other things as well. So, first of all, I have Stephen King's Elevation, and then I have Jason Starr's The Next Time I Die. Um, to start off with, Stephen King's Elevation, it was a pretty good book. This would be a good book for like going on an airplane or something like that. I wouldn't put a whole lot of effort into it. It's a quick read. It has a good message. Sometimes it's a little overhanded, I felt, but I had been wanting to read this for many years because when it came out, it got some pretty good reviews. And like I said, it was a pretty enjoyable read. I would actually, my thoughts are that it kind of goes along as a long short story. I mean, it's basically a novella anyway, but it probably could have been trimmed down to an even shorter story. The the idea is essentially that Scott Carey has started losing weight, even though he's not losing mass. There's no explanation for this. He just starts realizing that anything that is connected to him, his body, his clothes, if he puts things into his pockets, even, or if he touches something, then the weight that is there becomes less and less, and he anticipates at some point he's going to lose all of his weight and ultimately, go up into the air and disappear. And then he gets involved with some neighbors of his. It's a same sex couple that has opened a sort of artistic Mexican restaurant in their town, and he wants to help support them because it's kind of a small minded town. So the idea of elevation is not just him elevating physically into the air, but also elevating the mindset of his neighbors and his town folk. So the for the most part, like I said, this was an enjoyable read. It's a quick read. It'd be a good airplane read, but it doesn't really go into anything that's completely unusual. And the explanation for why he is losing this weight in the course of his life is not really explained, but it was mostly a good one. So the next time I die, I actually picked this up at the library because I was reading a couple of other books that were a little bit more dense, and I wanted something fun and a little bit quicker read. And I've read a couple of the hard case crime books before. Coincidentally, they were mostly the Stephen King hard case crime books like Joyride. And when I was picking this up, I actually saw a guy who was looking at the fourth of the Dark Tower series, and I totally geeked out talking to him about my love of Stephen King whenever I was younger and all the books that I had read and the way that he gets into the intertextuality of his stories as well as stories on the outside, which I'll address later. So this book is essentially it's about a guy named Stephen Blitz who is killed while trying to help a young woman who is being manhandled by some guy, and he wakes up in an alternate life that is where his alternate self had been in a car crash, and now he is taking over that place. And then later on, he ultimately dies again, wakes up into another reality. The premise is actually really interesting. However, this character is garbage. He's the kind of character who comes into a situation completely confused by it, realizes what's going on, and keeps insisting that what he previously knew is as real as anything else for the people that he is now around, rather than simply accepting that, my circumstances have taken me from this place to this other place, and he just basically treats everyone like they are idiots because they don't understand that this other life that he lived existed versus the one that he is now in that he never expected. So I was actually really disappointed in this one. However, a good thing that came from it was that it actually helped inspire a story that I am currently working on that has nothing to do with this, honestly, but it has a little bit to do with an alternate reality thing. So, what I wanted to talk about is kind of what I touched on with the conversation with the young man that I had in the library about Stephen King and some of the intertextuality and things like that. But it really goes to why I think reading is so enjoyable. I personally am a compulsive reader. I always have books. And even this morning, I knew I was going to finish a book that I was currently on while I was at work. So I took two books because once I finished the first one, I would just roll right into the second one. And that's kind of always been the way that I read. I'm not a particularly fast reader, and I read in segments. I think at most I'll read 20 minutes at a time, but I'm always reading, and it's one of those things that I think about because I have people comment, oh, you have a new book, or I always see you reading. And I know that a lot of the people that are on BookTube are really talking about their love of reading. And I think the vast majority of us do read simply for the pleasure of reading, for the entertainment aspect of it. And, there have been reports showing that reading fiction actually increases one's sense of empathy and also a lot of times helps with emotional intelligence with children even. And I have a couple of articles that I put up concerning that. I've been in the Army for 22 years and I've traveled extensively in that time frame. And like people will report how smells will take them back to a place or certain light will. I actually, I think of books that I read in certain locations. And some of those books were memorable to me and some of them not as memorable, you know. But I still think of, I read that book in this location. And whether it was Master and Margarita in Green Bay, or I read Mouse in Hood River on my anniversary, I, you know, I was in Honduras when I read both Machiavelli's The Prince and The Inferno. I started the Expanse series while I was there. I remember reading, A Cat's Cradle on a single plane ride because I started it as we were lifting off and I finished the last page literally as we were touching down. And there's things like that. There's also a couple of books that particularly in mind that I remember the location that I first saw them and received them. Lilith, there was this little Christian bookstore that I went to in Texas. There was this used bookstore that is still around. It's been around for, 40 or 50 years now, I guess, that where I got before Adam. And it always comes to mind that anytime I'm talking about books, that those bits and pieces, certain light or certain locations when I was reading a particular book. And it pulls into you. And I find that, the conversation that I had with the man in the library about the Dark Tower series and about how Stephen King connects so many of his books, and with him being so well read, he references a lot. And I'm not saying that, that makes him a great writer. I think that it makes him a great reader. And I've read, some great writers that never make any kind of mention of either their own work or other work that is being around. And it fascinates me, particularly with Stephen King, which I don't read as much Stephen King now as I did whenever I was younger. But when reading him, you can pick up references to books that sometimes are obscure. For instance, actually in the book Tommy Knockers, which is not one of Stephen King's best, but it's kind of fun, he actually makes a reference to the book Lilith. And mostly, if you hadn't read Lilith or loved it like I do, you would probably think it was Alice Through the Looking Glass, because it's the kind of giant mirror that you step through and there's this other world piece to it. But it's fascinating because the more that a person reads, I find the more they're able to reference other things. And it's not just about the empathy thing, about putting yourself into the mind of a character, but it also expands the way that you can see things around the world. And when I was in Honduras, because a lot of times whenever I would go to places that I'm away from my family for extended periods of time, that's where I read more complicated work. You know, generally I have more time to read, obviously, and as well, I prefer to get into some of the classics that I've either left off before or I want to revisit, like the Iliad and the Odyssey, and those. And I like having some of those origin stories, in my background. So I've gone through those, and it gives you a chance to, really think about how, like, some of the progression of the world, whether it's politically or ideologically or just, just culturally, how we have changed or evolved. And it's not just the voice of the authors, but it's the stories that they do tell and how those ultimately become part of our collective consciousness within our society. And some of the books that are sometimes smaller but have such an impact, because whether it's Heart of Darkness, the reference to the horror that has been in The Simpsons, it's been in Seinfeld, it's of course they made Apocalypse Now off of it, or you even get things like Of Mice and Men, that story. I remember the first time that I finally read it, I felt like I had read it before because it was part of our culture and just little references to it that are here and there. And if you haven't read them, you might not know that that's the reference that they're making. And so I find that it's fascinating, especially when you get around other people who like to read or who have read extensively. And, it's one thing. I don't have a problem with people who read, just a certain type of thing. I've known a lot of people who are really just into mysteries or really into just like highbrow literature. But if you read across the different genres, I find that you start actually seeing a little bit more of the world than simply reading in a certain genre. My personal genre of choice, for the last several years has been science fiction. And even though I'm not as much into like fantasy or world building, I prefer science fiction and even fantasy that's more grounded kind of in the experience that we have. So like the Expanse series, it's even though it's far flung from what we have, it's still within the realm that we have established, and then it's taking it from there. And so I really prefer that kind of story because ultimately, and one of the reasons why I enjoyed Stephen King, I think, is that I like the character driven or situational driven. But basically, I like reading all across things. I just recently read one of my first, true westerns because I haven't really read that many westerns, and I've always wanted to read a couple, some westerns. And my father is actually a big Louis L'Amour fan, and so it interests me to break into these other, genres to see what they have, because being a child of the 80s, westerns were pretty big back then, and a lot of them kind of, reference other elements of those, because even Star Wars has a Western aspect to it, right? And the scene where Han Solo cuts open the tom tom and stuffs Luke inside to keep him warm, there were Western books that my dad would tell me about how those situations happened within the Western, where the horse had fallen over and it's the dead of winter and they're out in the middle of nowhere, and the only way that they can survive is to hollow out the cavity of the horse and put their loved one inside to keep them warm. So I think that there's a lot of value to read cross literature and cross types, because it's not just the genres, it's also styles and things like that. Whether it's House of Leaves, which is very experimental, or going into Ulysses, which I have not done yet. I've tried it. I've bought the book. I've owned it for years, but I have yet to get it through it. I've read all of his other stuff, but I haven't been able to get Ulysses just because that stream of consciousness thing is very difficult, and it's one of those books that I was planning on reading if I ended up getting deployed again. So anyway, I think that I'll close this out. I've been rambling for long enough, I'm sure. But so for the two book reviews, this one was decent. It's I wouldn't turn people off of it. This one was a hot mess. It was a soup sandwich, but the idea was pretty good, and it doesn't turn me off to hard case crime. But I don't know that I'll be revisiting the author anytime soon. So, oh well. Well, if you have any thoughts about your reading experience or some of the conversations that you've had in the past about other books, because I know that we all have some of our favorites and we really geek out over those, and other people are completely ambivalent about those books that we love. For instance, my love of Lilith, it is probably the number one book in my life. My sister recently has attempted it. I don't know if she's finished it, but she flat out asked me, "Why do you like this book?" And I think that it is phenomenal. And if I could write that book, that's the book that I would want to write because of what it contains. And we all take that stuff in, as an individual. And I'd be really interested in knowing what some of your experiences about those kind of books are. So until next time, I will see you later.